Evening, everyone. I'm Phil Hansen, the president of Global Minnesota. I want to thank you so much for joining our conversation today on the art of diplomacy with Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat. I want to offer a special welcome to students from Carleton College and other academic institutions that are joining us this evening, as well as our many Global Minnesota members that are joining us tonight as well. For those of you who are new to Global Minnesota, we are the state's premier nonpartisan, nonprofit organization for advancing international understanding. We're kind of a one-of-a-kind organization for informed discussion, access to influential world leaders, exposure to different cultures and perspectives, and firsthand insights into the current relevant global issues and topics of our times. We offer public events, professional exchanges, discussion groups, and children's programs, all of which bring people together for a better understanding of our world. In a turbulent and changing world, Global Minnesota programming provides a much-needed context and clarity on global events. This past year alone, Global Minnesota has engaged over 18,000 participants in 550 events and activities spanning over 150 countries. I think it's important to note that Global Minnesota members make our programming possible. Member support is especially important now as we are seeing a growing demand for our programs while we're simultaneously really facing rising costs and reduced federal funding. To learn more about our membership and upcoming programs and events, please go to globalminnesota.org. Diplomacy is a thoughtful and careful exercise in negotiation and persuasion. As noted in Ambassador Eisenstat's book, The Art of Diplomacy, the ability to build trust is essential, as are a high degree of intelligence, patience, stamina, and preparation. As we look around today at the rising conflict across the world, what can the great diplomatic breakthroughs of the past tell us about resolving the challenges of the present? Tonight, we are honored to have with us Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat to discuss and offer behind the scenes a look at the 50 years of diplomacy and share insights from his book, his latest book, The Art of Diplomacy. And I should note that we'll have a link in the chat for the book availability at Magers and Quinn in the Twin Cities, if you'd like to pick up a copy of his terrific book. During a decade and a half of public service in 6 administrations, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat has held a number of key senior positions, including Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Undersecretary of State for Economic, Business, and Agricultural Affairs, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. He has written several books, including Imperfect Justice in 2003, President Carter, The White House Years in 2018, and of course, most recently, The Art of Diplomacy in 2024. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Elie Wiesel Award from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. To help moderate our discussion, we are also very pleased to welcome Star Tribune editorial reporter and columnist John Rash, author of the popular weekly Rash Report column. His focus on foreign policy as an editorial writer has taken him on reporting trips to Japan, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Rwanda, Turkey, and all over the world. Thank you both for joining us for this timely conversation, and I'll turn it over to John Rash to moderate our conversation today. John?
Well, thank you very much, Phil, and thanks everyone for joining us, the students at Carleton, and I will say the students everywhere, because particularly with international issues and foreign affairs, we're all students continuously trying to learn, and we're on a very steep learning curve as we have a change in administration and in many ways a change in the global order with what is happening with Washington and capitals around the world. My first introduction to Ambassador Eizenstat was when he came and spoke at an event at the Humphrey Institute after he had written his very well-received book on President Carter. It was at an event that you had a fact checker there, no less an authority than Vice President Mondale, who indeed weighed in, and introduced by Senator Klobuchar as well. And I was quite taken by the breadth and depth of research and the thoughtful and thorough approach that the ambassador had taken in analyzing an administration that he, of course, had a front row view of. When President Carter went into hospice, I immediately thought of that evening, thought of the ambassador, contacted him over a weekend, and true to his public service ethos, he got back to me on a Sunday, had a great conversation, and I was very fortunate and blessed to get a great column out of it. Like many, I didn't think it would be long once the former president went into hospice, but of course, maybe only Ambassador Eizenstat was the only one who would never underestimate President Carter. So I revisited that column a year later when he unfortunately passed away in relatively recent months here. We had a chance to briefly chat yesterday and before this dialogue, and I look forward for all of you from hearing his insights, which indeed we're going to start here by having him address all the attendees. When he is finished, I'll come back with a few questions, and then certainly while he is speaking and while he's responding to my questions, I encourage you all, please, to send in your questions, and they will be sent to me, and I'll get to as many of those as possible. So without further ado, Ambassador, please, thanks again for joining us, and please feel free to let us all know your thoughts.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it very much. And I want to say that I owe a tremendous amount of gratitude to Phil Hansen for inviting me to speak to this distinguished group, my very good friend and former colleague, Ambassador Ross Wilson. And when you mentioned Carlton, just literally today, as I came back from Kansas City, Kansas, I was shown a long and I must say very positive review of my book, The Art of Diplomacy, from a professor at Carleton. So that established a relationship even before we began tonight. I wrote this book for three reasons. The first is that we face seemingly insoluble problems, and I wanted to show how U.S. diplomacy over the past 50 years had been able to solve equally daunting problems and could do so again. Second, we are in the midst of two hot wars, one in Gaza, one in Ukraine, and we have gone through an era in which we've had a series of U.S. military activities, the Vietnam War, the two Balkan wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, the two Iraq wars under Presidents Bush I and II, the Afghan War, which was the longest war in American history, 20 years, and the war in Libya, which President Obama said was his biggest mistake. And we have had, to say the least, a mixed record in using military force as an instrument of diplomacy. And I wanted, therefore, to take a really hard look at when, whether, and how military force can be used and when it shouldn't be for sustaining diplomacy. And third, I'm concerned that we're entering a new era, John and Phil, in which we are tending toward a unilateralist, almost isolationist view of foreign policy. It's our way or the highway. And this is not the way to solve problems. And so the third reason that I wrote this book was to show how U.S. engagement in the world with our allies had led to the solution of many problems, had led to a less conflicted world than we would otherwise have, and that if we withdraw behind our two oceans, if we try to go it alone with all our allies, we will leave a huge vacuum into which the Russias and Chinas and Irans, with very different interests and very different values, will fill, and we'll have an even more conflicted world for our children and for our grandchildren. Now, the starting point to talk about the art of diplomacy is to say, what is diplomacy? And to put it very simply, it's the ability of an American negotiator to convince the other party, it can be one country, it can be multiple parties, that it is in their national interest to do what is in our national interest. And that, by definition, means it has to be, for both sides, a win-win situation. They have to be able to come back to their publics, to their leaders, to convince them that they have an agreement worth supporting, just as we do on the other side. It's not a game of poker where it's winner take all. And that is absolutely critical to understand. The beginning point of a successful negotiation, but not necessarily the end point, is for the President of the United States to appoint the right person at the right time for the right issue. For example, Henry Kissinger, it's almost unthinkable that we would have had the opening to China without him. And he wrote the foreword to this book, by the way, just before his 100th birthday. Another example is German reunification. It's unthinkable we would have had it without Jim Baker's excellent negotiations, and he wrote the preface to my book. Jimmy Carter was an essential person at Camp David. Without him, we wouldn't have had the Camp David Accords. We wouldn't have had the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland without George Mitchell. And yet, you shouldn't look at negotiations as waiting for a man or a woman on horseback to come with his or her sword and be the solution. If the parties themselves don't have any common ground, as we are seeing now between Hamas and Israel, that even the best negotiators can't succeed. But still, having the right person is crucial. And in interviewing 130 people, both almost every Secretary of State, several presidents, ambassadors, leading generals, foreign officials like Tony Blair and the Prime Minister of Ireland, Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, I found that there were a set of common skills that these negotiators brought to their task. The first is the ability to seize a historical moment when it comes and have a fierce determination to bring it to a conclusion. Example, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and I can assure you no one anticipated it. George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, saw this as a great historic opportunity to reunite the divided Germanys after World War II. And not only that, but to do it within NATO. This was a huge lift, as we'll discuss a little later. It's a lift because all of our wartime allies were against it. The Soviet Union, which controlled the eastern part of Germany, had lost 20 million people. The British and French had fought 2 wars against Germany and were not excited about having a reunited, strengthened Germany at the center of Europe. Margaret Thatcher herself, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, said, "I love Germany so much, I want to keep 2 of them." Second skill is the skill of courage, not the courage of the soldier on the battlefield, but the courage to take political risks that may depart from what your own political base wants. Examples, Anwar Sadat goes to Israel in 1977 and loses his foreign minister over it to pledge no more wars. More recently, in 2020, the Crown Prince, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, of the UAE, normalizes relations with Israel. This was not popular with his public. He thought it was important to his country. He had the courage to go forward. And perhaps the most stunning example is in Northern Ireland. I have a whole chapter devoted to this. The Catholic and Protestant forces, through their militias, had engaged in what the British and Great British understatement called the Troubles. Well, the Troubles had killed 3,500 people and maimed tens of thousands of others. And finally, the Catholic and Protestant leaders said, enough is enough. We've got to find a way to stop this. And they had the courage to go forward and reach an agreement with the help of George Mitchell, the so-called Good Friday Agreement. Third, a great negotiator needs to have a high degree of intelligence, an inquisitive mind, but also the wisdom and good judgment to size up people. Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, and Henry Kissinger had that when they, in 1972, made an agreement called the Shanghai Communique and opened relations between the 2 countries. Next, and since you have a lot of students from Carleton, is preparation. There is no substitute, just like doing your homework and studying for an exam. There is no substitute for a negotiator knowing his or her brief, all the issues, and looking at it from both sides so that you can find the areas of compromise. There is no substitute for that. Let me give you another example. We're now on our 13th and last day at Camp David. President Carter has drafted 22 peace agreements and shuttled between the Israeli and Egyptian cabins and Sadat and Begin. Sunday comes, the 13th and last day, and Prime Minister Begin comes to President Carter's cabin and says, Mr. President, I'm sorry, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. We've come close, but I simply can't compromise anymore. Please get me a limousine to take me from Camp David to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me back to Jerusalem. Well, Carter, realizing that if Sadat left without an agreement, and Sadat had to come back empty-handed after his courageous trip to Israel, it could mean not just his government, his life. Also, it would be, of course, a blight on President Carter's own leadership. So because of preparation, he had read the CIA profiles on both Sadat and Begin and knew that Begin's soft spot, and he was a tough, tough negotiator, but his soft spot was a great love for his 8 grandchildren. So President Carter asked his personal secretary at Camp David, Susan Clow, to get 8 copies made of the original photo of the 3 leaders when they first came to Camp David on day 1, and to get the names of each of his grandchildren. And he personally endorses to each of Begin's grandchildren, Jimmy Carter with hopes for peace, walks over to Begin's cabin and hands him those 8 photos. He sees Begin vocalize the names of each. He sees tears coming in Begin's eyes, his lips quivering. He puts his suitcase down and he says, Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. And it was on that occasion that the final agreement was reached. It wouldn't have been reached without a high degree of preparation by President Carter. Next is a skill that may seem obtuse, and yet in looking at my own career in negotiating and the 130 other people I interviewed, this came up as one of the most important. And that is, you can sometimes get so wrapped up with what you think is the brilliance of your own presentation at the negotiating table, you forget what the other side is saying and thinking. And so the ability to listen to the other side and put yourself in their shoes. What does that person need to take back to be successful? And can I live with a compromise on that? That ability to listen is crucial. The ability to put yourself in the other side's shoes is crucial. It's what, when I was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, my boss, who was Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, went on to become president of Harvard, called unsympathetic empathy for the other side. Example, 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria have surprised Israel with a dramatic attack on the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur. Caught totally unprepared, Israel sustains tremendous losses. Their air force is decimated. And Golda Meir, the prime minister, is under tremendous political pressure because she wasn't prepared. So, because of Kissinger and Richard Nixon, we rearm Israel and they start going on the offensive. And they've got Sadat's Third Army, the cream of his army, surrounded in the Egyptian Sinai. Kissinger, standing in Sadat's shoes, says to Golda, yes, you'll get a temporary victory if you decimate that Third Army, but you will have humiliated Sadat and he'll never make peace with you. You've got to find a way of giving him the opportunity to get that Third Army back and have something to carry back to Cairo. And she listened and did. And that was crucial to getting the first and second partial disengagements that Kissinger negotiated and was a key element in our ability to get Camp David done. Next is developing trust and confidence and a personal relationship with your negotiating partner. And that can sometimes be very difficult because you're dealing with very tough characters, some who are very adversarial. But it's absolutely essential. If you don't have trust and confidence of the other side, you're not going to reach an agreement. Again, example, in the midst of the German reunification talks, they're stalled. And Jim Baker, Secretary of State, has asked Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, to come to his personal retreat in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, away from the lights of Washington and Moscow. And over 2 days, they bond personally. They talk about their children, their grandchildren, their hopes for a peaceful Europe. And Shevardnadze has the ability now, with that confidence, with that personal relationship, to overcome the objection of his own foreign ministry to a united Germany in NATO and to convince President Gorbachev that it's in the Soviet Union's national interest to do so. That would not have happened without that personal confidence. I had it when I negotiated my German slave labor agreements and Holocaust negotiations with Count Otto Lambsdorff from Germany. We developed a very close personal relationship. Next is creativity. Now, I call this the art of diplomacy. It's like an artist painting on an easel. There is a creative sense of diplomacy. They're not straightforward. You're going to always, in any major negotiation, hit what seems a stone wall that seems insurmountable. And you need creativity to get around it, sometimes, interestingly, by using ambiguous language that each side can interpret for its own interest. The best example of that is in the Northern Ireland Good Friday talks. So the 13 political parties, Protestant and Catholic, who were arrayed around the table, at the same time as the negotiations are going on, the militias are still killing each other. And this became absurd. How can you negotiate a peace agreement in the midst of ongoing conflict? And Mitchell, Senator Mitchell, who had been the Senate majority leader and was used to herding cats, said, why don't you both disarm mutually, put your guns aside? And they refused because neither trusted the other. So creatively, he came up with what became known as the Mitchell principles. That is, you can keep your arms, but you have to sign this piece of paper saying that you won't use them during the course of our negotiations. And that creative solution allowed the talks to go forward and ultimately to success. Next, to use a sports analogy, international negotiations don't last a day, they don't last a week, they don't last a month, they can last years. And so it's like running a marathon with a sprint at the end. It seems always to end at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. And therefore, one crucial ingredient is stamina. The stamina to withstand this kind of pressure with no sleep, to think clearly. The whole term shuttle diplomacy was given when Henry Kissinger, for 2 weeks with virtually no sleep because he wanted to keep the momentum going, went during the 73 war at the very end, between Damascus and Syria, Cairo and Egypt, and Jerusalem and Israel, to reach an agreement. Jimmy Carter averaged over those 13 days at Camp David maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. When I did the Kyoto climate change negotiations in Kyoto, Japan, we got about 3 or 4 hours of sleep. So this is really absolutely a crucial ingredient. And then to shift to another sports analogy, good negotiators shouldn't try to swing for home runs because they'll end up striking out too often. You should go for what I would call singles and doubles. If you swing for the home runs, and you may end up with nothing. give you an example. Before Camp David, Jimmy Carter had worked with the Soviet Union to reconvene the 1973 Geneva Conference with 22 Arab countries and Israel to try to resolve every issue: the West Bank, the status of Jerusalem, the Golan Heights in Syria, the Egyptian Sinai. It was too much weight for any agreement to bear. And so it collapsed. Camp David was a bilateral agreement only between Egypt and Israel. The Palestinians weren't even there because they refused to come. They refused to accept UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. So you say, well, it was only a bilateral agreement. Well, that bilateral agreement, yes, it was not a home run, but it took Egypt out of the picture as a military threat to Israel, which was its greatest military threat, and it provided the foundation for the 1994 bilateral agreement with Jordan, and then under President Trump with the Abraham Accords, with peace agreements with the UAE, with Morocco, with Bahrain, and with Sudan. So you take these partial agreements and you build on them rather than trying for more than the weight will bear. Next is the use of what we call back channels. Back channels occur when sides are so antagonistic, they literally won't get in the same room to negotiate, like we see now with Hamas and Israel. The back channel here is Qatar and Egypt. The way in which the famous Oslo Accords in 1973, in which there was mutual recognition between 1993, mutual recognition between the PLO and Egypt occurred by a back channel. The famous Norway talks were totally back channeled with unofficial representatives from the Palestinians and the Israelis. So much so that when the framework was finally agreed to and taken to Prime Minister Rabin, he literally didn't know that the talks were going on. So again, back channels are crucial to build confidence up before you get to the formal negotiations. Next, there is always a tendency for a president, newly elected, to feel that he knows better than the successor. Perhaps he defeated him, and therefore he's going to go his own way and depart from agreements that his predecessor has made. And for that reason, we are often in the United States not reliable negotiating partners. Let me give you two polar opposites of the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. 1980, Ronald Reagan defeats us, that is President Carter, decisively. And there were a lot of reasons for it: the hostage crisis, inflation, but also President-elect Reagan, who was running for office, criticized our SALT II nuclear agreement, saying we gave too much to the Soviets and too little for ourselves. Now, we, of course, disagreed, but that was what he said. And yet, when he came into office, he honored the SALT II agreement, even though the Senate had never ratified it, because he knew that if he pulled the rug out from under the Soviets and said, well, I don't like what Carter did, that when he tried to negotiate the next phase of nuclear talks, which ended up in the START talks, the Soviets would say, well, we have no confidence because you didn't honor what we negotiated with President Carter. So that was the right way. The wrong way has been done several times by President Trump. In his first term, he pulled out of the Paris climate change agreement. He also pulled out of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran, in 2018, saying that he was going to apply, quote unquote, maximum pressure to get a better deal. Well, by pulling the rug out from under not just Iran, but from all the members of the Security Council who were co-signatories to that agreement would have lowered the enrichment levels of uranium to a little over 3%, which is civilian grade. Now, because we pulled out, it's 60%. And within 2 to 3 weeks, they can go to 90% and weapons grade. We got 2/3 of their centrifuges dismantled. Now they bought a whole new generation spinning out uranium at even faster speeds. We decommissioned a plutonium plant, cemented it in. Now it's running again. So this was a catastrophic decision to make. And when you depart from what your predecessor has done, there are real costs to be paid. The last attribute or skill is the creative use of leverage. Now, we all use, when you think about it, leverage every single day in our personal lives, with our friends, with our spouses, with our partners, with our children, with our grandchildren. Somehow I seem with my grandchildren to have less leverage than they do, but that's the way it is. But seriously, leverage is crucial, and the way you apply it is crucial. There are two types of leverage. One is positive leverage. This occurs when you open our US market, the biggest in the world, to another foreign government as a way of greasing the skids and the wheels for another agreement. An example fairly recently is the UAE normalizing relations in 2020 with Israel. The last thing they wanted was not another concession from Israel. It was F-35 fighter jets from the United States. And President Trump properly used that positive leverage. They got it, and that sealed the deal. Negative leverage takes a number of forms. First, it is economic sanctions. The United States has more sanctions against more countries than all the other countries in the world combined have against each other. It's sort of our default mechanism. We don't know what else to do. And I was the sort of sanctions meister during the Clinton administration, negotiating with the European Union and others. Sanctions are one weapon to use, but they are less useful than they used to be because we have a global supply chain. We don't have a monopoly on many products. If you look at the sanctions we have now, we have sanctions on Venezuela because Maduro has stolen 2 elections and he's still president. We have sanctions against Iran and they're still advancing on the nuclear program. We have sanctions on Russia and they're still fighting Ukraine. So these sanctions, again, I'm not saying they can't be useful, but they can't be dispositive. Second is one that we have not seen recently until the Trump administration, and that is his tariffs. He is using tariffs as a negative leverage to force concessions on the other countries. We're still in the midst of those negotiations. We'll know within 60 days how successful they are. Certainly, they've caused an enormous amount of turbulence and harm in the short term. The next negative leverage is the threat, not the use, the threat of military force. Example, 1994, Haiti. A general has deposed the properly democratically elected Prime Minister Aristide. And President Clinton sends a delegation with former President Carter, General and former Secretary of State Colin Powell, and Senator Sam Nunn to try to convince the general to let the Prime Minister come back into power. He refuses until President Clinton gets B-52s taking off toward Haiti. And indeed, some parachutists actually start jumping down near Haiti. And the general gets the idea that his days are numbered and he leaves and the Prime Minister comes back. The last and most consequential negative leverage is the actual use of military force. And about a third of my book is devoted to the use of military force in many of the places I mentioned at the beginning. Now, this is the toughest, most gut-wrenching decision a president can make. I've served in 6 administrations, and there's no more difficult decision of wrenching that a president has to make than to send young men and young women into combat. And in interviewing a number of leading generals who were involved in these wars, as well as the diplomats who helped try to negotiate therein, there are the following lessons, which I'll quickly mention, and then we'll go to our question period with our distinguished moderator, John. Lesson number one, it should be the last option that you use after exhausting every other option to achieve your goal. Diplomacy, economic sanctions, the threat of war, all should come before you go into battle. Second, it has to be in the supreme national interest of the United States to have U.S. troops and U.S. military forces involved. These are tough calls. What is in the supreme national interest? President Clinton has said to me in the interview I did with him, and he said it in other places as well, that the decision he most regrets in his 8 years in office was not sending military force in to stop the humanitarian slaughter, the genocide that was occurring in Rwanda. But there is a genocide occurring right now as we're engaged in our discussion in Sudan, where the Arab Sudanese are slaughtering by the thousands Black Sudanese. But it's simply, as cold-hearted as it seems, not in our national interest to commit our military. It should be done by African countries, by the African Union, but not by us. Next, and this is a crucial lesson that Israel forgot to this day in Gaza. And it was given to me by Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor to George W. Bush, Bush #2, and to President Bush's Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. And that is, they said, we, the United States, often get it backward. We put our military in first, and then we decide what do we want politically at the end of the road, when it ought to be the other way around. Decide politically what your achievable political objective is and build a military strategy around that. Again, here we're in our 16th month of fighting in Gaza. Israel still doesn't have a political objective in mind of what replaces Hamas. That's absolutely crucial. Next, know that there is a dynamic in even the best planned military actions, that things can go awry. One of the reasons we fought 20 bloody years in Afghanistan against the Taliban was because it took several years for the United States to realize that the Taliban had a safe haven, a refuge, just across the border in Pakistan that we could not attack. Pakistan is an ally. We were getting our own military equipment through Pakistan. They could rest, relax, rearm, and then come back. That was not recognized initially. Now, a second example is what happened in Kosovo in 1999, where we're working with NATO and as part of NATO for 77 consecutive days of bombing in Serbia to get their strongman Milosevic to start negotiating with the Kosovarians. And during one of those 77 days, we mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing several Chinese diplomats. To this day, they think we did it on purpose. We did not, of course. But it just goes to show that the best laid military plans will always have instances like this. Next, if you're going to use force, I'm now quoting Colin Powell in his interview, it has to be decisive force to get the job done. And let's contrast now the two Iraq wars with Bush 1 and Bush 2 to see how this plays out. President George H.W. Bush and Colin Powell do it right. They go in to fight because Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait to try to take their oil fields away. They had a limited political goal of getting him out and back into Iraq. But they got a UN resolution authorizing force, including, by the way, the Russians and Chinese. They got a NATO resolution authorizing force. They got a congressional resolution. And they had a coalition of 38 countries that had a combined military force of 500,000. This was decisive force, and it worked. Contrast that with what happened 12 years later in 2003 with his son, Bush II, George W. Bush. No UN resolution, no NATO resolution, a very thin coalition, and Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, doesn't say we're going to use decisive force. He says we're going to use a light footprint. Those are his words. Only 10,000 troops. And it was not enough. And we had to have surge after surge after surge going into the Obama administration because we didn't put decisive force in. Next, if you're going to invade a country, you have to understand the internal history, the dynamics, and the politics of it. As General Petraeus said to me, you need to know the nuances of the country before you invade, and we did not in Iraq and Afghanistan. Last is good intelligence. There is no substitute for good intelligence in using military force. Remember that the reason we got into the second Iraq War under George W. Bush to depose Saddam Hussein was because the CIA reported that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And the Bush administration felt putting weapons of mass destruction in the hands of that kind of dictator could destabilize the whole region. Well, as we remember, when we got in on the ground and we deposed Saddam, no weapons of mass destruction, never found. I learned through my research in this book that indeed Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, but he destroyed them before our forces went in. Well, why didn't he say so and save his own neck and his regime's and thousands of young men and women on both sides? Because he was afraid if he admitted that he had destroyed them in accordance with UN mandates, that it would embolden his domestic opponents and Iran, his archenemy, to possibly invade. Now, I was subject in the Carter White House to one of the worst intelligence failures in American history. Let's put ourselves back in 1978, late 78. The Shah of Iran is on the throne. He has been on the throne since we put him there as a young man in 1953, engineering a coup with the British to take the popularly elected Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh out and reinstalling the Shah in his father's throne, the so-called Peacock throne. And since then, under 6 American presidents, Democratic and Republican, he was our guy in the Middle East. We gave him an open shopping list of anything he needed. So here's the faulty intelligence, the fatally faulty intelligence. 6 weeks before the Shah, seemingly impregnable, is forced to leave his country, the CIA reports to President Carter that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor a pre-revolutionary state. He's in great shape. Well, a president can't make a decision based on that. That's a proper decision. 6 weeks later, he was gone. So intelligence is absolutely crucial. Now, let me conclude, and then we'll go to John Rash's questions, with what Tony Blinken said, and I think it's a good way of ending, former Secretary of State, of course. He said that in order for American diplomacy in the 21st century to be successful, as it's been in the past, it has to be based on a strong United States militarily, politically, and economically, and one in which we have common cause and don't have the kind of polarization we have today, which Putin and Russia sees and plays on. And we've got to have the capacity and the willingness to project and defend democracies around the world, as we were doing in Ukraine. And that is crucial in the 21st century. We have to remember that diplomacy is still the best way to solve problems short of war. War has the very problems I mentioned. So with that, I would like to conclude my opening remarks and then go to John Rash's questions and ultimately to yours.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ambassador. And those were quite compelling comments, both historically and in many ways in the current context. And indeed, that's perhaps a good way to begin these questions. And parenthetically, as our friends and colleagues at Global Minnesota suggest, anyone who has questions, please submit them in the Q&A feature in this webinar. And, if we go back to, the administration that you wrote about, you're perhaps most known for, again, you spanned 6 of them, as you said, but if we go back to the Carter administration, it's quite striking, Mr. Ambassador, how many issues are still have relevance and resonate today. And let's start with one of them because it's as recent as yesterday in the Oval Office. And of course, I'm talking about Prime Minister Carney's meeting with President Trump. And, we go back to the Carter administration, and in a very well documented event in the movie Argo, but certainly in the annals of diplomacy, was Canada's cooperation with the US government, led by you and your colleagues, in terms of being able to protect a certain number of hostages who, in effect, took refuge in the Canadian embassy. Those of a certain age, which means me, I can remember living in Chicago at the time, a teenager, and one of the local newspapers printed on the back page a huge Canadian and American flag in color, which newspapers rarely did back then, saying "Thanks, Canada," and encouraging readers to put it in their front windows. And it's extraordinary.
Yes, I wish that Prime Minister Carney had mentioned that yesterday to President Trump. And by the way, John, one of the interesting things is President Carter was tempted to take credit for getting those 6 hostages into the Canadian embassy and then out. It was an incredible job of subterfuge, but he restrained himself, even though it might have helped him politically, because he knew if he took credit for that, it might make it more difficult on those who were still held hostage.
So spin this forward a bit and put it in the current context of relationships between Washington and Ottawa, and the President Trump's approach to Canada, how that has diplomatically played on both sides of the border, and where this extraordinarily important relationship goes from here, and how this fits into the art, or perhaps, as some see it, the inartful display of diplomacy that has transpired over the last several months.
So, John, in many ways, President Trump has turned diplomacy on its head. 80 years of post-World War II diplomacy and many of the lessons in my book. So, for example, one key issue that I mentioned was the need for preparation. But the decision on saying Canada should be made our 51st state, or we should take over Greenland, or we should take over the Panama Canal Treaty, or we should have tariffs, was not done with the kind of preparation that every other president would use, what we call the interagency process. You get the agencies together, the White House coordinates it, you get the pros and cons of the different options, the economic and political costs. These were decisions made in the first weeks of the administration before the full cabinet, let alone the sub-cabinet, was even in place. Second is that, as I mentioned, the capacity to listen to the other side, to put yourself in their shoes. He's certainly not doing that, just the opposite. Is trying to bulldoze them with pressure. Developing a personal and positive relationship. That's not been done either, quite the opposite. Respecting agreements by your predecessors. Well, I've already mentioned pulling out of the Paris climate change agreement and the nuclear agreement of 2015. So in all of these, leverage is crucial, but it's all negative leverage. It's all trying to bludgeon the other side. And that doesn't work. The other side is representing a sovereign country too. They can't be seen as, unless you're a very tiny country, as sort of bowing to the knee to the United States. That's not the way to carry on successful diplomacy. Now, here we had this meeting in the Oval Office just yesterday, and I thought that Mark Carney handled one part of it very adroitly by saying, we don't want to be the 51st state. And he said, Mr. President, you have a history of successful doings in real estate. There are some things that are not up for sale, like the White House that you're in now, or Buckingham Palace. And the same is true with Canada. It's not up for sale. Importantly, the president said he was going to keep the 25% tariff on Canadian-owned, the Canadian-produced automobiles. Now, maybe there'll be an agreement somewhere down the road, but it certainly didn't start yesterday. So this is really putting diplomacy on its head. And the other thing is, if we believe, as I do, and I think most people on the Republican and Democratic side, that our biggest adversary is China, then we want to build allies in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and so forth, the European Union, Australia, Canada. You don't build those kinds of alliances if you're attacking them with tariffs. It just pushes them away. If anything, it pushes them into China's hands. This is a gift to China.
So speaking of China, as well as adversaries, the cover of Foreign Affairs this month that I'm sure that you've seen, Mr. Ambassador, and probably several of our attendees have silhouettes of Presidents Trump, Putin, and Xi. The headline ending with a question mark is "The Committee to Run the World." What do you see happening from a grand strategic perspective? Is this indeed a planned attempt by President Trump to move back to, more of a historical model of geopolitics? If so, to what degree of success or failure do you think that this will have? And, for those other players that you mentioned who always have a vote in this, be it Canada, the European Union, Southeast Asia, India, other nations, how do you think this is playing out right now?
Well, if there is a strategy behind the foreign policy, it is the concept, and the president has not articulated it this way, but certainly his actions would seem to indicate it. And that is, he sees the world in a great power context. The United States, with the Western Hemisphere being ours. Russia, with its great mineral wealth and nuclear arms, being the big guy in Europe. The European Union, I was ambassador to the EU, it's the one biggest trading partner we have collectively. They share our democratic values, the rule of law, and so forth. They're to be sidelined. They're just not strong. And then China in Asia. And that's the sort of way in which I think he sees the chip flying. But that is meaning that we're not using our alliances in ways every other president did. NATO is crucially important to make sure that Russia doesn't go into Moldova, doesn't go into to the Baltic states, doesn't use Ukraine as something as they did with the state of Georgia, country of Georgia, and that is a tripwire. So it's very important that we not look at the world in that tripartite way, but rather that we build on our alliances. I mean, what's amazing, what we've done up to this point before we put 46% tariffs on Vietnam, is Vietnam has gone from an enemy with whom we lost 58,000 young men and women, and they're on this magic wall in Washington. And yet they're now, although they have to keep in terms with China because China's right next door, but they're really coming closer and closer to the United States. And yet when we put these kind of tariffs on them, it pushes them right into China's arms.
You mentioned Mideast negotiations, including the extraordinary efforts and success of the Camp David Accords, one of the questions, that we have gotten already here is certainly could relate, to the Mideast, to Gaza, to Hamas. And the question is, how have the rise of non-state actors changed the way diplomats approach traditional state-to-state diplomacy?
Well, that's a great question, and I will answer it very specifically. But let me just continue, if I may, on one other point. President Trump's model is not the Republican presidents immediately before him, Reagan, Bush, the two Bushes, Eisenhower. It's William McKinley, who was president in 1897, and who stood for two things: high tariffs and expansion. That's where we got Guam, we got the Philippines, and in a line that was missed by commentators in the president's own inaugural address, he said the United States needs to be an expansionist power. And that explains a lot of, the talk about Greenland and about Canada as 51st state, about taking over Gaza and making it the Riviera of the Middle East, taking the Panama Canal back. So I wanted to get that context out. Now, to answer the question, non-state actors are now more important than they ever have been because they have the capacity with technology that can be easily duplicated, like drone technology, to be major thorns in the side of established states. The Taliban, after all, was a non-state actor. Hamas, you can say it was a state actor because they controlled the government of Gaza, but they really are in many ways a non-state actor. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a non-state actor. So these non-state actors who proliferate also in some of the African regimes, in Sudan, in the Congo, are very difficult because they don't have any context in which to negotiate. They don't have the same mindset that even difficult states have. They are radical. They don't mind taking huge losses. And to negotiate with them is very difficult, as we're seeing with Hamas. I mean, any logical government, given the terrible punishment that Gaza has gone through following the biggest massacre of Jewish lives since the Holocaust on October 7th, 2023, would say, look, for our own people, it's time for us to put our arms down and reach an agreement. That's not the way Hamas thinks. It's not the way non-state radical actors think. They will go away and then want to come back another day. So dealing with non-state actors is extremely difficult, and they're particularly difficult, John, in states which are themselves weak states, which are failing states, which don't have the capacity to deal with them. So let's look at Pakistan right now. We saw the headlines about India and Pakistan fighting each other. Pakistan has a battle with a major non-state actor. It's the Pakistan Taliban, not the Afghan Palestine, but certainly a close cousin. So when states like Pakistan, which have their own structural problems, have to face that kind of insurgency, it's extremely difficult.
Well, when we talk about non-state actors and perhaps the changing state of geopolitics with Mr. Trump channeling his presidential predecessor, William McKinley, it's perhaps good framing for another question from one of our participants tonight, which is, does a new geopolitical order, like the one we seem to be entering, now require a new type of diplomacy? How do these geopolitical changes impact the current institution of American diplomacy?
I think that the lessons that I lay out in my book apply as well in the 21st century as they did in the 20th century. Indeed, some of the agreements that I discussed were actually reached in the 21st century. So I don't think they make them irrelevant at all. But there is this major change, and it's not the non-state actor thing, it's something even more pervasive. And that is the last book that Henry Kissinger wrote with Eric Schmidt, former Google head, was called AI and Diplomacy. How will artificial intelligence affect diplomacy? And here, there's a real problem, because diplomacy depends on privacy. It depends on making agreements that don't reach the light of day initially. That's why President Carter went to Camp David. It was to get everybody away from the press, away from their own constituencies. You can't negotiate openly, but AI makes that very difficult. The capacity to look at secret cables, the temptation to leak, and even worse, the ability of AI and opponents to come up with what appears to be an accurate statement, but it's totally false, designed to undermine the negotiations. You know, what is false and what's true in an AI world becomes much more difficult. Once it gets on the internet, on social media, a whole host of people take it for granted that this is true. So trying to negotiate in a digital world is extremely difficult and much more complicated.
So speaking of that, before I get to some other questions, President Trump himself in his first term and certainly in his second, at times seems to not shun, but embrace this digital diplomacy by making pronouncements and sending, at times, even direct messages to fellow world leaders, as he did with Prime Minister Carney before their meeting in a very frosty note to his Truth Social account here. To what degree do you think that, this is an anomaly, as with many aspects of the president and his administration, or perhaps a new way where diplomacy is, becoming more open and deployed more in this way through world leaders, in part simply to respond to President Trump?
So, John, it's a great question. This is exactly the wrong way to negotiate, because when you publicly say the things that President Trump is saying, it puts the other side at a huge disadvantage. It looks like they're going to be weak if they agree to what the president has said publicly. These are negotiations that need to be carried on privately, so you don't humiliate the other side. You cannot reach good agreements if the other side feels that they're going to be shown by their own people to be weak, to be humiliated. You can't look at them as just an adversary to be ground into the sand. They have to be seen as partners. And that means keeping agreements quiet, not leaking, not posturing publicly. It's absolutely the wrong way to negotiate.
You mentioned your book a moment ago, and certainly many of these lessons from your direct experience and, how you've transmitted this. And so one of the questions we want to get to here comes from John Olson, who has such a influential and tremendous role in educating many of the young people, the students who are taking part tonight. And he asks you to please summarize the unique diplomatic situations mentioned in the chapter Unsung Heroes and explain what special lessons could
I'm sorry, which chapter?
Unsung Heroes.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And explain what special lessons could be taken from those diplomatic breakthroughs.
So I had a chapter called Unsung Heroes about Ambassador Crocker resolving the Southwest Africa civil wars, in which you had South Africa occupying Namibia, you had Cuban troops in Angola, and what Ambassador Crocker was able to creatively do is to have linkage. And this took tremendous battles within his own administration. And may I say that one of the things that I stress in my book and didn't have time to talk about here is sometimes the most difficult negotiations you have are within your own government to get a consensus. Nobody wanted Ambassador Crocker to deal with the Cubans. And he said, I can't solve this without it. So he developed the concept of linkage. The linkage was South Africa would get out of Namibia, which was important to the Cubans and to the Russians. And at the same time, you would have the Cubans get out of Angola, which was important to the South Africans. And that linkage was really crucial. It was a sort of three-arm play, and it was done really brilliantly. And it took 2 or 3 years to do. And again, he had to constantly fight within his own administration to get the negotiating authority to do it. The second unsung hero in this chapter is my dear friend Bernie Aronson, who was the mediator between the government of Colombia and the FARC, which was a non-state actor. Okay, now, what Bernie was able to do is establish trust in the FARC, which distrusted the United States intensely. And he said during now the Obama administration, FARC, listen, Obama is a different type of president. Just because you're on the left doesn't mean you're excluded if you are willing to join a peace process. And he had a great president of Colombia as well to negotiate with. And Bernie also established a personal relationship with one of the key leaders of FARC in an interesting way. At the outset of these negotiations, this FARC leader had a serious health problem and was hospitalized. And Bernie went to the hospital and spent several hours with him, not trying to negotiate, but just commiserating and hoping he got well and talking about good health. And that one act of personal diplomacy was hugely important. So in each of these instances, Colombia and Southwest Africa, you had extremely creative decisions by people who don't make the headlines. I mean, Bernie Aronson and Ambassador Crocker are not household words, household names, but they're crucially important. And I particularly wanted to show how people who don't make the headlines can also be extremely creative in reaching agreements that seemingly are insoluble. I mean, the Civil War in Colombia had gone on for 50 years.
Well, when you mention Ambassador Crocker, I believe you're speaking of Ryan Crocker, who
That's right, Ryan Crocker.
indeed and a extraordinarily well-respected, even legendary diplomat, spanning several administrations. So it begs the question, as there are legislators on Capitol Hill, people within the administration who have suggested changing the way diplomats are chosen in this country. We have, I believe, some former Foreign Service officers who are taking part in this conversation tonight, and certainly John Olson, who I mentioned before, Naval Intelligence Officer. Say a few words, if you will, about those ideas, about the strength, and if you think it still is important principle to have diplomats chosen through the very rigorous Foreign Service exam process.
I'm glad you asked that question. And I have worked either in or with every government agency during my career. And I can say without exaggeration that the most talented, dedicated, creative people in any agency I've ever worked with or in are the career Foreign Service people. They're an enormously talented people. The Foreign Service exam is very tough. They have to go through language training. They serve 3 years in one post and come back for language training in a completely different post. So I'll start with that proposition. Now, having said that, I want to make 2 critiques of the way in which we deal with our ambassadors. Number one, we have, and This is a statement against interest because I was a political appointee as ambassador to the EU. We have too many political appointees, and certainly too many who are totally unqualified for their job. Just because you're a political appointee doesn't mean you're unqualified, but a lot of them are. They just give a lot of money to the campaign. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture, so we have compare our foreign service with any other in the world, and we have fewer career foreign service officers than any other country in the world. And that means fewer people who are really talented in knowing the countries to which they're posted. Number two, criticism, is the way in which foreign service officers are treated. Now, this is my own view. It's not totally shared by a lot of foreign service officers. But what happens is we will send a young foreign service officer to work in a consulate in a particular country. They have the language capacity. Then 3 years later, we send them to an entirely different part of the world. They go to the Foreign Service Institute in Virginia to learn a different language. They learn that language, then they go to a third country with a different language. We need to have, particularly in the Middle East and in some of the key Asian countries, people who are in there for the career. That doesn't mean they stay in one country, no, but that they stay in that region, that they understand. For example, if you're in the Middle East, you speak Arabic, you understand the history of that culture. We just don't take advantage of that. And it's even worse with our generals. So let's take General Petraeus as an example. He turned around the Iraq War. He had, in the interview, he had 3 words that allowed him to turn it around after 10 years. Clear an area of terrorists, hold the area, which, by the way, the Israelis have not been able to do in Gaza. And third, and crucially, build. That is, build a future for the non-combatants that show them it's better to align yourself with the moderates and not the radicals. He had a sign in his office saying, "How many Iraqi civilians have you saved today?" That's not being done in Gaza. But that's not the broader point I want to make. The generals have a rotation on average of 13 months. So after Petraeus does this great job in Iraq, he's sent to Afghanistan. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. We need to have career foreign service officers who stay in the region a long time, and we need to have military officers who stay longer than 13 months. They just are learning about a country before they're sent to another one. So we don't use our brilliant career foreign service officers, in my opinion, in the way they should be. Again, they have too much competition from unqualified, oftentimes non-career political appointees.
Well, I've been told by our friends and colleagues at Global Minnesota, we have time for one more audience question, and I certainly don't want the evening to end without asking about framework of a conflict that has roots, going back not just to the times you've served at government, but well before then. And you spoke earlier about some of the challenges with the Soviets, during your years in government. Later, of course, the Russians after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in particular, because in another Global Minnesota event tomorrow, we have the Consul General of Ukraine from Chicago, who is going to be here and addressing attendees at the Humphrey School as well. And so a really pointed question with a whole lot of complexity, but it is, do you find that Presidents Putin and Zelensky still have a realistic chance of negotiating a ceasefire in the near future?
Yes. Henry Kissinger said in one of the interviews I did, you can't win at the negotiating table what you don't achieve on the battlefield. And that's why it's so important to arm Ukraine, to give them the capacity to take as much of their territory back as they can. And here I served, President Biden. He appointed me to the head of the Holocaust Museum. I've known him for 50 years. He did a great job of keeping NATO together. But the U.S. was, in my opinion, always a dollar short and a day late in getting the sophisticated arms to Ukraine they needed at the time Russia was on its heels. Now we're throwing out the question of whether we're going to give them anything. And that creates a leverage for Putin, not our ally. That's point number one. Point number two, it is possible that the way this will end is the way we ended the Korean War, without a treaty, by an armistice with a control line like the DMZ between North and South Korea. And if we do that, we shouldn't acknowledge the right of Russia to keep that territory, nor should we eliminate the sanctions. Number three, it's critically important we do not negotiate behind Zelensky's back. It's interesting that the special envoy for the United States has seen Putin 4 times in Russia, but not our Ukraine ally. We've negotiated behind our allies' backs twice in recent history. In Vietnam, Kissinger got a Nobel Prize for the Vietnam Peace Treaty, but he negotiated that solely with the North Vietnamese, without the Saigon government in the negotiating room, for whom, again, we lost 58,000 men and women. And then go into the Trump and Biden administrations in Afghanistan. We negotiated solely with the Taliban, and the government of Afghanistan, for whom we were purportedly fighting for 20 years, was nowhere to be found. We must not do that with Zelensky. And last, the most important and difficult issue will be guarantees. So yes, there'll be a ceasefire because there'll be a mutual exhaustion. You know, Putin can beat his chest all he wants. He's lost 800,000 soldiers, either dead or wounded. He's lost a third of his Black Sea fleet. His economy is a wreck. So he's going to come to terms as well. That's why he's using the North Koreans. But here's what Zelensky's going to say. I talk about putting yourself in the other shoes. Let's all of your students, all the people who are listening, let's put ourselves in Zelensky's shoes, okay? We're looking at Putin straight across the table now. And Zelensky says to us, you have a saying that fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And he'll say, we've been shamed and fooled twice. 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia agreed in return for Ukraine giving up the 3rd largest nuclear force in the world. And that was violated by Putin when he invaded Crimea. And second was the Minsk Agreement in 2015, in which the fighting in the very area that's occurring now, the Donbass, and we, the United States, signed that and assured Ukraine against any further Russian intrusions. 7 years later, February 21st, 2022, Putin says, quote unquote, Minsk is no more. He tears it up and invades. So Zelensky's to say, well, wait a minute. What happens now a third time? What assurance? You're not going to let me into NATO? So how do I know that this won't happen a third time? The best answer to that, which is not a perfect answer, is get them into the European Union as fast as we can. Number one, it's hard for Putin to invade a European Union country. Number two, build on the agreement that Biden did agree to, a long-term 10-year relationship militarily, have the Brits and the French and the others agree as well to give them arms, and allow the French and Germans and the British, and the French and British have already said they'll do this, to put their troops in as a tripwire. So all of those need to be in place if this is going to be solved.
Well, thank you very much for that perspective and for sharing your experience and expertise tonight. Thanks to Global Minnesota for the honor of moderating this discussion. And especially just thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Ambassador. And I'll turn it over to Global Minnesota's Phil Henson.
Thank you, John. And again, a huge thanks to you, Ambassador Eizenstat, for a tremendous program. I feel like between back channel, stamina, preparation, leverage, And I'm not sure the next time I introduce you, I can put in there Sanction Meister, but I may just do so. But it was just a tremendous presentation for all of us. Huge thanks to all of our participants that were with us tonight. I saw a number of folks that have served their country in foreign service and military. I saw on here with our participants, John Olson, our ambassador, Ross Wilson was with us tonight, Tom Hansen, Margot Squire, amongst many other folks that have been of tremendous service. And so it was great to see them joining us to listen in tonight as well. Again, I remind folks to definitely take a look at Magers and Quinn for the ambassador's tremendous book. It was interesting to see the endorsements and the folks that wrote your between Kissinger writing your foreword and Baker writing your preamble to the book. Clearly a tremendous book that we have, or Baker, I mean, writing your preamble to your book, just tremendous a book to get a chance to take a look at. And we learned an awful lot tonight from you, Ambassador, and we appreciate you sharing your time.
A special wave to my friend and former colleague, Ross Wilson, Ambassador Wilson, a great public servant.
And we are deeply fortunate to have Ambassador Wilson in our state with us. John. And again, thanks to John Rash. As always, John, you are a tremendous supporter and advocate of all things international in our state. And it's always great to listen to you and have you be a part of our programs as well. To the rest of the group tonight, just to say we do have some conversations. John mentioned we have the program tomorrow with the Consul General from Ukraine, although I'm afraid to say that one is sold out for us. It's been a very popular program coming up on that one. We also have a program coming up on AI and national security. We have a program coming up with the Ambassador of Luxembourg. If you'd like to join us for that, don't forget, if you haven't heard 100 times already, the Global Minnesota Gala is coming up as well. So be sure to come join us for that. It's going to be a terrific program to celebrate cultures from around the world. Again, huge thanks to our team at Global Minnesota, Melissa Gildner, Nick Hayen, Eric Iverson, and others who helped to put together tonight's program for us. And again, just thanks to everybody who is serving within this sort of great ecosystem of international serving organizations and folks that have worked around the world to continue our efforts to try to make Minnesota the most welcoming place we can in the world for our international visitors and those that come to engage with us here. Thank you to all of you again. Have a great rest of your evening. And I think we are concluded for the night. Thanks, everybody.